inhabitants of Europe were exposed to the militarization of life and language, the erosion of individual freedom and social differences, the disruption of economic life, the drain of wealth, the hardships caused by food shortages, the growth of collectivization and bureaucracies, the collapse of the international system, and the release of huge reservoirs of aggressivity and violence. There would be no returning to the old ways. In Tsarist Russia, the regime had been tottering before 1914, and after more than 3 years of sacrifice, the national will to carry on was all but dissipated. By early 1917, despair and resentment had led directly to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II. The new provisional government disastrously tried to carry on the war, but the army's morale and will to continue went from bad to worse. By October, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, seizing the moment to their own political advantage, had succeeded in taking power almost without firing a shot. There was no one left to defend the government. The war had opened the door to revolution and communism. Thereafter, Lenin and the Bolsheviks combined terror and missionary zeal at home with a fervent belief that it was their destiny to bring the blessings of communism to the West. Russia was not alone in losing its monarchs. In 1918 and 1919 in Central Europe, socialist and communist revolutions followed the lost war and drove out the old leaders. There were also unsuccessful attempts to establish communist regimes in Berlin, Munich, Vienna, Budapest, and elsewhere. In the early 1920s, there were several renewed efforts, with Soviet encouragement and assistance, to bring about a Russian-style revolution in Germany. The post-war normality in Europe was marked by political violence, attempted and successful coups, assassinations, bands of uniformed thugs in the streets, and general instability. This climate was conducive to the rise of new parties and, above all, to the emergence of radicals and dictators on the right and the left, who, backed by the enraged, the zealots, and notably also by young idealists, tried to turn the general crisis to their own advantage. After 1918, when the war ended, there was a persistent feeling of living merely in an interregnum between wars. The war monster was prepared for the next round that began in September 1939. The Second World War was, however, anything but a rerun of the old conflicts that had been in abeyance since 1918. From the mid-1930s, the ideological and political conflict between Nazism and communism that had raged for more than a decade was reflected in growing international tensions. The new conflict erupted over Poland, and it escalated across Western Europe until, ultimately, the world descended into a maelstrom of destruction and horror that was far deadlier than even the Great War. In Europe, the ideological clash between Nazism and communism added an entirely new dimension to the conflict that had engulfed the same nations during the Great War. There was a new viciousness as the armed forces threw aside the conventions of war, and national and ethnic hatreds roared out of control. Ethnic cleansing, population transfers, deliberate targeting of civilians, and mass crimes became the order of the day. One way or another, every country on the continent became entangled in the Holocaust. The systematic mass murder of Jews at the hands of German forces during the Second World War was at the heart of the great catastrophe I deal with in this book. The Jewish people in Europe became caught up in the hatreds and emotions following the First World War. They were killed in the hundreds of thousands in the Russian Civil War. Those crimes, committed mainly by white forces against the Reds, were the worst pogroms in Russian history, far deadlier than anything that had been seen in the days of the Tsars. The sheer scale of the calamity that befell Europe in the Second World War defies the imagination. A sense of being immersed in the great catastrophe was conveyed in numerous ways by many people, few more strikingly than a Russian artist during the siege of Leningrad. She wrote in her diary, "In all this worldwide..."